The champagne tasted like defeat. I smiled for the cameras anyway, the bottle trembling slightly in my grip as confetti rained down around me. Third place. Again. The roar of the crowd felt distant, muffled under the weight of disappointment crushing my chest. Someone's hand clapped my shoulder, my team manager, his grin not quite reaching his eyes. "Good showing out there, Mila," he lied. I nodded, swallowing back what I really wanted to say. 12 years professional racing, and I was becoming the queen of almost. Almost champion. Almost good enough. The Salt Lake City International Speedway felt especially cruel today, the autumn sun too bright, exposing every flaw in my performance. "Your rear suspension was off by at least 2 millimeters. The voice came from behind me, female and matter-of-fact. I turned to find a striking redhead, arms crossed over her oil-stained jumpsuit, blue eyes sharp with assessment. "And your entry angle on turn 3 cost you at least half a second each lap." "Excuse me?" I bristled, champagne sloshing over my gloved fingers. "And you are?" "Angela Moore, your new head mechanic." She didn't extend her hand, just nodded toward my car being wheeled back to the pit. "That machine can do better. So can you." The audacity stung worse than the loss. "I've been racing since before you had your driver's license, sweetheart." Her eyes narrowed, not at the condescension but at something else. "Then you should know better than to blame your equipment when it's your technique that's failing." Heat rushed to my face as nearby photographers swiveled our way, sensing conflict. My manager stepped between us, all fake smiles and damage control. But I couldn't tear my gaze from this woman, this stranger, who'd just publicly dissected my failure. The after-party was mandatory torture. I stood in the corner of the hotel ballroom, nursing a whiskey that smelled of smoky regret, watching sponsors and team owners circle each other like sharks. My dress, silver and fitted, felt like armor now, keeping me upright when all I wanted was to collapse. "Your father called," my manager murmured, materializing beside me. "Says you're not returning his messages." I flinched. "Tell him I'm busy becoming a disappointment." "Bailey Racing needs a win, Mila. The sponsors are getting restless." "Don't you think I know that?" My whisper was harsh, fingers tightening around my glass until my knuckles blanched. That's when I saw her again, Angela, transformed from jumpsuit to a simple black dress that somehow made her even more imposing. She was engaged in conversation with our team owner, gesturing with elegant hands that I now noticed were calloused from mechanical work. Something about her made me uneasy, like she could see straight through the chassis to my engine. Later that night, I found myself alone on the hotel balcony, Salt Lake City's lights blurring through unshed tears. My phone buzzed, another text from my father. "We need to talk about your future with the team." The metallic taste of fear flooded my mouth. Racing wasn't just my career, it was my identity. The only place I'd ever felt alive. "Tough day?" Angela appeared beside me, offering a fresh drink, her presence both unwelcome and oddly steadying. "What do you want?" The night air carried the scent of her perfume. Something unexpected, not floral but spiced, like exotic wood. "To win." She leaned against the railing. "And I think you're the driver who can make that happen, despite today." I laughed bitterly. "You literally told me I suck hours ago. I said you could do better." Her gaze was direct, unflinching. "There's a difference." Lightning crackled across the distant mountains, illuminating her face for just a moment. In that flash, I saw something in her expression I couldn't identify. Determination, yes, but something else, something personal. "Why did they hire you?" I asked suddenly. She smiled, a careful thing. "Because I'm the best." Then softer, "And because I specifically asked to work with you." The thunder that followed seemed to echo in my chest, a warning I couldn't decipher. I didn't know then that Angela Moore carried secrets that would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. Or that the woman critiquing my driving was actually steering me toward a truth someone had spent 3 decades burying. I've done some stupid things in my racing career, but throwing a wrench across the garage during a live interview probably tops the list. In my defense, the reporter had asked if my emotional female temperament was affecting my performance. The wrench just happened to sail past Angela's head and into a very expensive toolbox. "Congratulations," she said dryly as my manager dragged me away from the cameras. "You just turned yourself into exactly the stereotype they wanted." 2 hours later, I found myself sitting across from the team owner, Gerald Hill, a man whose gray mustache seemed to droop with disappointment. Angela stood by the window, arms crossed, looking annoyingly composed. "Community service," he announced, sliding a folder toward me. 4 weeks teaching mechanical skills and driver safety to kids in the rural outskirts. The PR team thinks it'll help your image. "You're joking," I said flatly. "I have qualifying runs, testing, which you'll still do. This is afternoons, 3 days a week." He leaned forward. "This isn't a request, Mila. Your sponsorships are hanging by a thread." I flipped open the folder, scanning the details. "And why is she here?" I nodded toward Angela. "Because I'm going with you," she replied before Gerald could. "Team orders." The drive to the community center the following Monday was silent and tense. The autumn colors in the mountains surrounding Salt Lake City blurred as I pushed my personal car faster than I should have, secretly hoping my aggressive driving might make Angela nervous. It didn't. She just stared out the window, occasionally checking something on her phone. "Slow down," she finally said as we approached a curve. "These roads are different from the track." I deliberately accelerated instead, taking the turn with precision. "I know how to drive." "Yes, but do you know how to teach?" She turned to face me. "Those kids don't need a hotshot. They need someone who can connect." The community center was a faded brick building with peeling paint and a basketball hoop missing its net. Inside, 12 teenagers eyed us with the universal skepticism of youth. I launched into my prepared talk about racing dynamics, watching their eyes glaze over within minutes. Then Angela stepped forward, grabbing a dirty spark plug from her pocket. "Who can tell me why this failed?" she asked. A shy girl in the back raised her hand. "Gaps too wide?" Angela smiled. "Exactly. Just like relationships, too much distance, no spark." The kids laughed, and just like that, she had them. For the next hour, I watched as Angela translated complex engineering concepts into everyday language that made the teenagers lean forward in their seats. I stood awkwardly to the side, a trophy driver suddenly useless without her car. "You try," she murmured during a break, nudging me toward a boy who was examining the miniature engine model we'd brought. "That's the fuel injection system," I offered lamely. He looked up at me, unimpressed. "I know that. My question is why you brake so early on turn 4. I blinked, surprised. "You follow racing?" "Everyone here does." He gestured around. "You're kind of a big deal, even if you choked in the last race." I felt Angela watching me, waiting to see how I'd handle the blunt assessment. Something in me softened. "Want to know a secret? I brake early because I'm setting up for the exit. Sometimes looking slower in the entry gives you the advantage on the way out." His eyes widened with genuine interest, and suddenly I was surrounded by kids asking questions about racing lines and weight distribution. For the first time in weeks, I wasn't thinking about sponsors or standings, just the pure mechanics of the sport I loved. The transformation was short-lived. On our third visit, we arrived to find the ancient school bus that transported the kids had broken down halfway back from a field trip. The center director was panicking, night falling and temperatures dropping in the mountain elevation. "I'll go," I said immediately, grabbing my keys. "We'll go," Angela corrected, already heading to my car. "You don't know anything about diesel engines." The bus was stranded on a desolate stretch of road. 16 kids and 2 adults huddled inside for warmth. Angela disappeared underneath with a flashlight while I distracted the children with racing stories. Her face when she emerged was smeared with grease, a streak of it highlighting the freckles across her nose. "Fuel line's cracked," she announced. "I patched it, but it's temporary." I watched her hands as she worked, strong and certain. When it was time to leave, she hesitated, then wiped a smudge of dirt from my cheek, her fingers lingering a moment too long. Our eyes met in the beam of the bus headlights, and something electric passed between us. Back in the car, the silence felt different, charged rather than hostile. Rain began to fall, droplets racing each other across the windshield. "Why racing?" she asked suddenly. "Out of all the things you could have done." I considered deflecting with my standard media response about adrenaline and competition. Instead, I heard myself say, "It's the only place where fear feels like freedom." She turned to look at me, really look at me, for perhaps the first time. "That might be the most honest thing you've said since we met." Later that night, as I dropped her at her apartment, she hesitated before getting out. You surprised me today, she said simply. How's that? You were real with those kids. A half smile. I thought you only knew how to be Mila Bailey, racing star. As I watched her walk away, I realized with an unsettling clarity that I wasn't entirely sure who Mila Bailey was without the racing. And even more disturbing, I was starting to care what Angela Moore thought about her. The qualifying lap came down to milliseconds. I could feel the difference in the car immediately, the way it hugged the curves, responded to the slightest touch. Fourth place became third, then second. When I crossed the finish line in first position, the team erupted. Everyone except Angela, who simply nodded as if she'd expected nothing less. What did you do to my car? I asked later in the garage, watching her methodically check the suspension. Nothing radical. She didn't look up. Just listened to what it was telling me. Cars don't talk. Now she did look up, a smudge of grease highlighting her cheekbone. Everything talks if you know how to listen. The intensity in her blue eyes made me look away first. The next 3 races brought podium finishes. Sponsors who'd been threatening to walk suddenly wanted contract extensions. My father called with rare praise, though I noticed he credited the new mechanic rather than his daughter. The sting was familiar. You still tense up on the hairpins, Angela observed one evening as we reviewed race footage in the team's empty conference room. Everyone else had gone home hours ago. Old habit. I rubbed my neck, stiff from bending over the monitors. I crashed badly on one 10 years ago. Broke 3 ribs. She studied me rather than the screen. Fear memory. Your body remembers even when your mind tries to override it. Poetic for a mechanic. Mechanics understand trauma better than most. She stood, stretching. Machines and people aren't that different. Both carry the marks of past damage. Something in her tone made me curious. Is that personal experience talking? The corner of her mouth twitched. Let's just say I've been rebuilt a few times. After that night, something shifted between us. The community service program continued, but now we drove together in comfortable silence. Sometimes she'd explain a mechanical concept she was considering for the car. Other times I'd share racing strategies I'd developed over the years. It felt dangerously like friendship. Late one night, long after the team had left, I found Angela in the garage, completely disassembling my steering column. What the hell are you doing? I demanded, heart racing at the sight of my car in pieces 2 days before a major race. She didn't flinch. Come look at this. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, she showed me a hairline fracture in a component I couldn't identify. This would have failed during the race. At high speed, you would have lost steering capacity. That's not normal wear and tear, I said slowly, alarm creeping through me. No. Her voice was grim. This was deliberately weakened. The implication hung between us. Someone on the team wanted me to crash, or worse. We stayed until dawn, methodically checking every component of the car, finding 2 more subtly compromised parts. We tell no one, she whispered, our heads close together over the engine. Not until we know who. The scent of her, motor oil, coffee, and something distinctly her, made it hard to focus. Why would you protect me? You barely know me. Her hands stilled on the wrench. I know enough. The race that weekend was a blur of hyper-awareness. Every vibration, every sound from the engine had me searching for signs of sabotage. But the car performed flawlessly. I took second place, and for once it felt like victory. The celebration dinner was mandatory. Sponsors, team members, management all gathered at an upscale restaurant overlooking the city lights. I found Angela alone on the terrace, nursing a drink. Thank you, I said simply. She turned, moonlight catching the red highlights in her hair. For what? Possibly saving my life. I moved beside her at the railing, though I still don't understand why someone would. You're getting too good, she interrupted. Too quickly, someone doesn't like that. Or they don't like you. I studied her profile. You show up, I start winning, parts start failing. Coincidence? The muscle in her jaw tightened. You think I'd sabotage you after fixing you? I think there's something you're not telling me. I moved closer. Why did you specifically ask to work with me, Angela? The silence stretched between us, filled with the distant sounds of traffic and laughter from inside. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft. Because I've been watching your career since you started. I know every race, every crash, every victory. She finally met my eyes. And I knew someone was holding you back. Who? I whispered, though something in me already suspected. I can't prove it yet, but I'm close. Her fingers brushed mine on the railing, sending a current up my arm. Trust me a little longer? The question hung between us, laden with implications beyond the mechanical. I found myself nodding, though every instinct honed from years in a cutthroat industry warned against trusting too easily, feeling too much. Later that night, reviewing race footage alone in my hotel room, I noticed something odd. Angela in the background of a pit stop from 6 months ago, before she joined our team. She was watching me, expression unreadable. I froze the frame, staring at the proof that her interest in me predated everything she'd admitted. The question wasn't just who might want to harm me, but what Angela Moore really wanted, and whether her protection was simply another form of control I couldn't see. The manila envelope came on my birthday, a day I've never much cared for. 32 years old and spending it alone in my apartment overlooking Salt Lake City, takeout containers littering the coffee table. My parents had called earlier, the conversation stilted and formal as always. Your father and I expect to see you at the charity gala next month, my mother had said, instead of happy birthday. I was halfway through a mediocre glass of wine when the doorbell rang. No one was there, just the envelope on my welcome mat with my name handwritten across the front. Inside were medical records, a birth certificate different from the one in my safety deposit box, and DNA test results comparing 3 samples. My eyes caught phrases like 0% genetic match and inconsistent with biological parentage. The room tilted sideways. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela. Race prep tomorrow, 7 a.m. sharp. I sent back the only words my trembling fingers could type. I need you. 20 minutes later, she was at my door, rain-soaked and concerned. Her eyes widened at the papers spread across my living room floor. What is this? She asked, kneeling beside me. According to these, I'm not a Bailey. My voice sounded distant, attached. My DNA doesn't match either of my parents. Angela picked up one of the lab reports, scanning it with a mechanic's precision. Who sent these? I don't know. I pressed my palms against my eyes. My whole life. Everything about who I am. This doesn't change who you are, she said firmly, but something in her expression flickered. Recognition. Maybe even fear. Did you know? I asked suddenly, remembering the frozen image from the race footage, her watching me months before we met. Know what? About this, about me. I moved away from her. You said you'd been watching my career, why? She reached for my hand, her touch grounding me despite my suspicion. Mila, I swear I didn't know about this specific thing, but there's more to your racing team than you realize. I've been trying to figure it out. The wine glass slipped from my fingers, shattering against the hardwood. Neither of us moved to clean it up. Tell me everything, I demanded. But instead of answering, she pulled me to my feet. Not here. Your apartment might not be secure. The absurdity of her paranoia should have set off alarms, but nothing felt real anymore. I let her lead me to her car, the rain painting the world into blurry watercolors. We drove in silence through the mountains, climbing higher until the city lights were just a distant glow. I grew up in foster care, she finally said, pulling onto a viewpoint overlooking the valley. No parents, no roots, just a gift for understanding engines better than people. I waited, sensing this confession was leading somewhere. I know what it feels like when your identity gets ripped away. Her hands tightened on the steering wheel. Foster home number 4, I thought I'd finally found a family. Then suddenly, I was garbage again, shuttled off to the next placement. The rain drummed harder on the roof, creating a cocoon of sound around us. Her vulnerability broke something open in me. Without thinking, I reached over and took her hand. When I saw those records, I whispered. It was like everything that defined me was suddenly fiction. If I'm not Mila Bailey, daughter of racing royalty, who am I? You're the woman who can take a corner at 175 miles per hour without flinching, she said, turning to face me. The woman who made those rural kids believe they could be anything. That's not fiction. Lightning flashed, illuminating her face. The intensity in her eyes, the slight tremble of her lip. I moved toward her, or she moved toward me, I couldn't tell which. Our mouths met with the same precision as perfectly engineered parts finally connecting. The kiss deepened, her hands threading through my hair as the storm raged outside. Every touch felt like crossing a threshold I hadn't known existed, racing towards something both terrifying and inevitable. Later, tangled together in the reclined seats, my head on her chest listening to her heartbeat, I felt simultaneously lost and found. Her fingers traced patterns on my bare shoulder as rain continued to blur the boundaries between earth and sky outside. "I should have told you why I joined your team," she whispered into the darkness. I tensed, preparing for betrayal. "Tell me now." There were rumors about Bailey racing, things that didn't add up financially. I took the job to investigate. Her arms tightened around me. "But I never expected you. I never expected this." "What kind of things didn't add up?" "Money moving through shell companies, parts being replaced without documentation." She hesitated. "And your father's connection to Gerald Hill goes back 32 years. Exactly my age." The coincidence felt too precise to ignore. "I think whatever these DNA results mean," she continued carefully, "it's tied to why someone's been sabotaging your car. Someone's afraid of what you might discover if you look too closely at your family." I sat up, feeling suddenly exposed in more ways than one. "Why should I believe you're not part of whatever this is?" The hurt in her eyes seemed genuine, but I'd been wrong before. "Because I just risked everything telling you this." She touched my cheek. "And because I think I'm falling in love with you, which was never part of the plan." The confession hung between us, more shocking than the DNA results. I didn't know if I could trust her, or my feelings for her. But as the rain finally began to ease, one thing became clear: I needed to confront my parents about who I really was. What I couldn't have known then was that the truth would be far more dangerous than either of us imagined. The Bailey estate loomed against the backdrop of the Wasatch Mountains, marble and glass glinting in the winter sunlight. I'd grown up in this house, but today I felt like an intruder. "You're sure about this?" Angela asked from the driver's seat. I nodded, muscles tense like before a difficult race. "Wait for me." My mother answered the door herself, surprise registering briefly before her features composed into their usual perfect mask. "Mila, we weren't expecting you." Clearly. I brushed past her into the grand foyer, where photos of me at various races lined the walls, the Bailey racing legacy carefully curated. My father appeared from his study, drink in hand despite the early hour. "This is a pleasant surprise?" Nothing about what I was about to do felt pleasant. I removed the DNA results from my bag, placing them on the marble-topped console table between us. "Who am I?" The question echoed in the cavernous space. My mother's eyes flicked to the papers, then to my father, a silent communication passing between them. That single glance confirmed everything. "Where did you get these?" my father asked, voice dangerously calm. "Does it matter? They're real, aren't they?" I stepped closer. "I'm not your biological daughter." My mother sank onto a nearby chair, her perfect posture crumbling. "We were going to tell you." "When? After 32 years?" My father picked up the papers, scanning them with the same analytical gaze he used on racing statistics. "These were obtained illegally. Someone accessed your medical records without authorization. That's your concern? Not that you've lied to me my entire life?" He set his glass down carefully. "You were 3 days old when we adopted you. There was a fire at Salt Lake Memorial Hospital. Several infants were orphaned." A fire. The word felt significant somehow. And my birth parents? Dead in the fire. It was a tragedy that became our blessing. My mother reached for my hand, which I pulled away. "We couldn't have children of our own. You were meant to come to us." Something wasn't adding up. Why keep it secret? Why not just tell me I was adopted? My parents exchanged another look, this one heavier, laden with something that made my skin prickle. "The adoption wasn't entirely official," my father finally said. "Gerald had connections, he expedited things." Gerald Hill. The same man Angela had mentioned. "What exactly does that mean?" "It means we loved you so much that we took some shortcuts." My mother's voice hardened. "Everything we've done, the racing team, your career, it's all been for you." "Or for the Bailey legacy," I countered. Even as the words left my mouth, another realization struck. "Was I chosen specifically because you knew I'd carry on the racing tradition?" My father's silence was damning. The magnitude of what they were implying, what they had done, left me lightheaded. I need to know who I really am. My actual birth parents, medical history, everything. There's nothing to know. My father moved toward his study. The records were all destroyed in the fire. You're Mila Bailey. That's all that matters. But his eyes shifted away when he said it, the tell I'd known since childhood. He was lying. I left without resolution, the weight of 32 years of lies pressing against my chest. Angela was waiting, her face tight with concern. They admitted it, I said numbly as she drove us away. I was taken after a hospital fire, but something feels wrong about the story. She nodded slowly. Because it is wrong. That hospital fire was real. I looked it up after seeing your DNA results. But according to news reports, only 2 infants were in the nursery that night, and both survived with their families. Cold certainty settled in my stomach. They're hiding something bigger. That's not all. She pulled into an empty parking lot, killing the engine. While you were inside, I got a call from my contact at the Racing Commission. They've been investigating financial irregularities in several teams, including Bailey Racing. What kind of irregularities? Large payments to dummy corporations. She hesitated. One registered to a man named Victor Crane. I found his photo online. She handed me her phone. The man in the photo had my eyes. My exact eyes. This could be my father. I whispered, staring at the stranger with my face. He was a champion racer in the early 90s. Angela's voice was gentle. He died in what was ruled an accident on the track 29 years ago. 3 years after I was born, the timeline fit. There's more. She took back the phone, swiping to another image, a news clipping. Victor Crane was married to Elena Crane, also a driver. They were a power couple in racing until his death. She disappeared from public life afterward. My heart hammered against my ribs. You think she's my mother? That I'm their daughter? I think Gerald Hill was their team owner. Her eyes met mine. And that your adoptive father was their main competitor before taking over Bailey Racing following Victor's death. The implications were staggering. Had my father stolen not just a championship, but his rival's child? I need proof, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Real proof, not just theories. Angela nodded. I thought you might say that. She started the car again. I have an address for Elena Crane's last known residence. It's about 3 hours from here. As we pulled back onto the road, my phone buzzed with a text from my father. Whatever you're looking for won't change anything. Some doors should stay closed. I turned off my phone and watched the city recede in the side mirror, wondering which was worse, not knowing who you are, or discovering that everything you thought you knew was built on someone else's tragedy. The biggest race of the season was just 2 weeks away, but my mind wasn't on the track. Every spare moment was consumed with searching for Elena Crane. The address Angela had found led to an abandoned property in Wyoming, the trail cold. Focus, Angela murmured during practice runs, her voice steady in my earpiece. Your lap times are all over the place. She was right. Despite her mechanical wizardry, the car couldn't compensate for my distraction. After the 4th mediocre lap, I pulled into the pit. I can't do this, I admitted, yanking off my helmet. Sweat plastered blonde strands to my forehead, and Angela brushed them away with casual intimacy that still felt new. You can, she insisted. The car's perfect. You're the variable. Her bluntness was oddly comforting. In a world suddenly dissolved into lies, Angela's unvarnished truth was my anchor. By the end of the week, something clicked. Maybe it was muscle memory, or the need to excel at the one thing I could still control, but suddenly I was breaking my own records, cutting through the track with surgical precision. The team buzzed with renewed excitement, all except Gerald Hill, who watched from the periphery with calculating eyes. Something's shifted, he commented during a strategy meeting, studying my latest metrics. Your performance has improved dramatically. Angela's adjustments, I deflected, not missing how his gaze hardened at the mention of her name. Indeed. His smile didn't reach his eyes, though I wonder if there are personal factors affecting your concentration. The implication hung in the air. Several team members shifted uncomfortably. My relationship with the head mechanic is professional, I replied evenly, though Angela's quick intake of breath was audible in the silence. Gerald leaned forward. I wasn't referring to Angela. I meant your recent interest in ancient history. My blood ran cold. He knew I was digging into my past, into Victor Crane. The meeting disbanded with tension humming like a badly tuned engine. Angela caught my arm in the hallway. "He's warning you off," she whispered. "We must be getting close to something." As we walked to my car, a group of reporters intercepted us, unusual this deep in the secure area. "Mila, is it true you've been secretly working with this mechanic for years?" one called out. "Sources say your relationship goes beyond professional," another added, cameras flashing. Angela stepped slightly away from me, but I caught her hand, pulling her back. Something in me snapped, the weight of secrets, the pressure of pretending. "Angela Moore is an exceptional mechanic who's revolutionized our team's performance," I stated clearly. "She's also someone I care about deeply. That's all you need to know." The headlines exploded within hours. Racing heiress confirms relationship with female mechanic. Bailey risks sponsor backlash with same-sex relationship reveal. My phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Calls from my parents, from sponsors, from the team's PR department. I ignored them all, driving us to the mountain viewpoint that had become our refuge. The city stretched below us, lights twinkling against the deepening dusk. "You didn't have to do that," Angela said quietly. "I'm tired of secrets." I turned to face her. "My whole life has been one big fabrication, but this us is real." She kissed me then, a kiss that felt like coming home after a long journey. When we broke apart, her eyes were serious. "You may have just cost yourself everything, or gained something worth more." I traced her jawline. "Besides, they needed me more than I need them." But my bravado lasted only until morning. 3 major sponsors announced they were reviewing their partnership with Bailey Racing. My father left 7 increasingly furious voicemails. The team PR director sent an urgent directive for a clarifying statement. Angela's apartment was my sanctuary amid the storm. We pored over everything she'd gathered about Victor and Elena Crane, race records, interviews, photographs, looking for anything that might connect them conclusively to me. "Your racing style," she said suddenly, comparing videos side by side. "It's exactly like his. The way you handle hairpins, how you accelerate out of turns, it's genetic." The observation hit me in the chest. Nature versus nurture, blood versus upbringing. "What happens if we find Elena?" I asked, voicing the fear I'd been avoiding. "What if she doesn't want to be found?" Angela's arms came around me from behind. "Then at least you'll know the truth." "And if the truth destroys everything?" "Some things need destroying to build something better." Her phone rang, an unknown number. She answered, listening intently before her expression changed. "When?" she asked sharply. "Are you certain?" She hung up, turning to me with grave eyes. "That was my contact at the commission. Gerald Hill has called an emergency board meeting. He's presenting evidence that I've been industrial spying." "That's ridiculous," I started, but stopped at her expression. "It's not entirely untrue," she admitted. "I did access team records I wasn't authorized to see, looking for connections between Hill, your father, and the Cranes. He's trying to separate us," I realized. "Cut you off from the team, from me." "It gets worse." She swallowed hard. "The board meeting is scheduled for the morning of the championship race. I'm being set up to miss it." The ultimatum was clear: abandon my search for the truth and my relationship with Angela, or lose everything I'd worked for. What Gerald didn't understand was that I'd already lost everything the moment I discovered my life was built on lies. Now the only thing left worth fighting for was sitting right in front of me, green eyes blazing with determination, and something that looked remarkably like love. The anonymous email arrived 3 days before the championship race. "Your relationship is costing the team everything. Step away from the mechanic, or everyone will know what really happened to Victor Crane." I showed it to Angela, who read it with hands that weren't quite steady. "They're desperate," she said. But her voice lacked conviction. That afternoon, I was called into an impromptu meeting with the team management. Gerald Hill sat at the head of the table, my father beside him, a united front of disapproval. "The situation has become untenable," Gerald began without preamble. "Your personal choices have created complications with our sponsors." "You mean my relationship with Angela?" "We don't care what you do in private," my father interjected, though his expression suggested otherwise. "But publicly flaunting a relationship with a team employee." "Cut the crap," I interrupted. "This isn't about sponsors. It's about what Angela and I have discovered." Gerald's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Which is? That Victor Crane was my father. That somehow I ended up as Mila Bailey instead of Mila Crane. I leaned forward. And that his accident might not have been an accident at all. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Those are serious accusations, Gerald finally said. Based on what evidence? DNA doesn't lie. I crossed my arms. Did you help them take me? After the so-called hospital fire that never happened? My father's face had gone ashen. You don't understand what you're digging into. Then explain it to me. Instead, Gerald slid a document across the table. We're prepared to offer Angela Moore a generous severance package. In return, she signs this non-disclosure agreement and leaves immediately. And if she doesn't? The board already has evidence of her unauthorized access to confidential team data. That's grounds not just for termination, but potentially criminal charges. The threat landed like a physical blow. You're blackmailing me. We're protecting the team, Gerald corrected smoothly. The championship is within reach. Don't throw it away for someone you barely know. I stood steadier than I felt. Cancel my contract. I'm done. Gerald didn't flinch. You have a binding agreement with this team. Break it, and you'll never race professionally again. The worst part was knowing he could make good on the threat. The racing world was smaller than outsiders realized, and Gerald Hill had connections everywhere. Angela was waiting in the parking lot, pacing beside my car. They're trying to force us apart, I told her, relaying the meeting's contents. Her face grew more determined with each word. I found something while you were inside. A photo, Victor and Elena Crane with Gerald Hill at a charity event. The woman standing next to them is wearing the same unusual pendant you showed me in your baby pictures. The silver feather? My hand instinctively went to my neck, where I still sometimes wore the necklace my parents claimed was a family heirloom. Yes, that photo was taken 1 week before Victor's fatal crash. She pulled me closer, lowering her voice. And I managed to access Gerald's financial records from that period. 2 days after the crash, he transferred $500,000 to an offshore account. Hush money, I whispered. The pieces starting to align in a horrifying pattern. I think your father, your adoptive father, and Gerald arranged everything. Victor's accident, your adoption, all of it. Her eyes met mine. I think Elena Crane is still alive. That night, returning to my apartment, I found the door already unlocked. Heart hammering, I stepped inside to find my mother seated primly on the sofa, looking out of place among my casual furnishings. We need to talk, she said, her voice uncharacteristically vulnerable. About what really happened. She confirmed what we'd pieced together. Victor Crane had been deliberately sabotaged, though she insisted my father hadn't known the tampering would be fatal. Just enough to ensure Victor lost the championship race. Gerald arranged everything afterward, she explained, hands twisting in her lap. Elena was devastated, nearly catatonic with grief. When she discovered she was pregnant with you, She what? I demanded when she hesitated. She tried to take her own life. The doctors saved both of you, but Elena was institutionalized. Gerald convinced her that you'd be better off with us. Her eyes pleaded for understanding. We couldn't have children, and you needed parents who could give you everything. You stole me, I said flatly. From a woman who was too broken to fight back. We gave you a life Victor would have wanted for you, a racing legacy. Where is she now? My voice had gone dangerously quiet. Where is my mother? For the first time in my life, I saw my adoptive mother cry. Gerald kept track of her. She recovered eventually, but he convinced her you were better off not knowing the truth. Is she alive? She nodded slowly. Living under a different name in Colorado. She never remarried, never had other children. The knowledge that my birth mother was out there, had been out there all along, hit me like a physical blow. Gerald will destroy you both if you pursue this, my mother warned, rising to leave. He has too much to lose. As the door closed behind her, I sank to the floor, overcome by the magnitude of the deception. Not just my life, but Elena's too. Both of us robbed of each other for 32 years. My phone buzzed with a text from Angela. Be careful, someone followed me from the track today. The warning came too late. Outside my window, a dark sedan had been parked for hours, the driver watching with patient menace. The morning before the championship race, I found Gerald Hill alone in his office. the Salt Lake City skyline stretching behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. "I expected you sooner," he said without looking up from his papers. "Though I admit, I hoped you'd make the sensible choice." "You mean letting you blackmail me into giving up Angela and pretending my entire life isn't a lie?" I stepped closer to his desk. "That's not happening." He finally looked up, his expression unreadable. "You have your mother's stubbornness. Elena never knew when to surrender either." The casual mention of my birth mother sent anger flaring through me. Was murdering her husband and stealing her baby your idea or my father's? Such dramatic language. He leaned back in his chair. "No one murdered anyone. Racing has always been dangerous. But sabotage made it deadly. What happened to Victor was regrettable." He had the audacity to look somber. "The tampering was meant to slow him down, not kill him. Your father never forgave himself. Yet he still took Victor's child. We gave you opportunities Elena couldn't have." His voice hardened. "She was broken after Victor's death, institutionalized. You would have ended up in the system. That wasn't your decision to make." He stood, moving to the window. "The board meeting starts in 1 hour. Angela Moore will be officially terminated, her career in racing finished. As for you, you'll race tomorrow and continue with the team as planned. Or I ensure Elena Crane learns how her daughter betrayed her father's legacy by throwing away her talent for a mechanic with a questionable past." He smiled thinly. "Have you asked Angela about her time in juvenile detention? About why she's so invested in exposing me?" The revelation knocked me off balance. "You're lying." "Am I?" He slid a file across the desk. "Angela Moore spent 18 months in juvenile detention for computer crimes when she was 16. She's been obsessed with Victor Crane's death for years, long before she met you. You're just a means to an end for her." I left the file untouched, but doubt crept in like oil under a door. "The board meeting won't happen. I've withdrawn from tomorrow's race." His composure finally cracked. "You can't. The sponsors don't care about me anymore, remember? I'm damaged goods now." I smiled without humor. "But I've called a press conference for noon today. I'll be announcing my departure from Bailey Racing and sharing some interesting historical facts about the team's origins." The blood drained from his face. "You're bluffing." "Try me." I moved toward the door. "I've already lost everything that mattered. What else can you take?" "Your mother," he said quietly. "Elena has built a new life. This revelation would destroy her all over again." The emotional blackmail almost worked. I hesitated, hand on the doorknob. "Does she know I'm alive? That I race?" Something like pity crossed his face. "She knows you were adopted by the Baileys. She doesn't know you followed Victor's path." The cruelty of it staggered me. All these years she'd been out there, believing I was living some ordinary life, never knowing I was carrying on her husband's legacy. I left Gerald's office without another word, driving aimlessly through the city streets until I reached Angela's apartment. She opened the door looking exhausted, like she hadn't slept. "Were you ever going to tell me about juvenile detention?" I asked without preamble. She froze, then stepped back to let me in. "How did you?" "Gerald. He said you've been obsessed with Victor Crane's death for years, that I was just your ticket to exposing him." The words hurt to say out loud. She sank onto the couch, shoulders slumping. "I was going to tell you, after we found Elena." "So it's true?" "Yes, I spent time in juvie for hacking. And yes, I've been investigating Victor Crane's death since I was 19. She looked up at me, eyes blazing. "But not for the reasons Gerald implied." "Then why?" "Because Victor Crane was my uncle," she said quietly. "My mother was Elena's sister. After the accident, after they took you, my mother tried to fight for custody. Gerald ruined her financially, destroyed her reputation. We ended up homeless for a while." The revelation left me speechless. We were connected by more than just chance or attraction, by blood and shared tragedy. "You're my cousin," I finally managed. "Our second cousin." Her smile was sad. "Distant enough that what's between us isn't, but close enough that finding you, helping you discover the truth, became my life's mission." I moved beside her on the couch, taking her hands in mine. "Why didn't you tell me from the beginning? Would you have believed me? The mechanic who shows up claiming your whole life is a lie, that we're actually related, that I'm here to help you uncover a decades-old conspiracy?" She shook her head. I needed you to trust me first. I canceled the race, I told her, and scheduled a press conference instead. Her eyes widened. Mila, that's career suicide. Some things matter more. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against hers. I want to meet my mother. I want the truth to come out, and I want you beside me when it does. When her lips met mine, it felt like sealing a pact. Whatever came next, the press, the fallout, the uncertain future, we would face it together. There's something else, she whispered against my mouth. I found her address, Elena's. We can go now if you're ready. Ready? How could anyone be ready to meet the mother they'd been stolen from? But I nodded anyway, heart hammering against my ribs as we gathered our things. Outside, the dark sedan was gone, but I knew we hadn't seen the last of Gerald Hill or my adoptive father. They had too much to lose to surrender without a fight. 1 year can change everything. The small sign announcing Bailey Moore Racing Academy still gives me a thrill every time I drive through the gates. What began as a desperate pivot after the scandal became something far more meaningful than trophies or championships. They're here, Angela calls from the office, waving a clipboard. Her red hair catches the morning sunlight as she jogs toward the track where our first class of young female drivers is arriving. We chose this property on the outskirts of Salt Lake City for its isolation and sprawling acreage, perfect for teaching eager teenagers the fundamentals of racing without curious press lurking around. The scandal that erupted after my press conference eventually faded, as scandals do, but not before Gerald Hill was forced to resign amid financial investigations. My adoptive father retreated to early retirement, our relationship reduced to strained holiday phone calls. The real victory wasn't in their downfall, but in what rose from the ashes. Angela and I pooled our savings, secured investors who believed in our vision, and created something neither of us had growing up, a place where talent mattered more than connections. Miss Bailey, a gangly girl with determination in her eyes approaches me. Is it true you're going to let us drive actual race cars today? I smile, recognizing the hunger in her expression. Modified training cars. You need to master fundamentals before pushing 200 miles per hour. But, eventually? She presses. Eventually, I confirm, if you put in the work. Angela joins us, brushing her hand against mine in a gesture now so familiar it feels like breathing. Girls, gather around. Safety briefing first, then we'll assign cars. As she leads them toward the classroom building, my phone vibrates with a text. Elena, still on for dinner tonight? My relationship with my birth mother evolved slowly after our first tearful meeting. The woman who opened her door to find the daughter she thought lost forever has become a steady presence in my life. She teaches advanced driving techniques at the academy twice a month, her expertise undiminished by years away from the track. The barber girl has real potential, a voice remarks behind me. I turn to find Martin, our head instructor and former race engineer. They all have potential, I correct him. That's the point. He nods, chastened. The local news is here again. Something about your nomination for the Women in Motorsports Award. Angela's nomination too, I remind him. Our partnership, professional and personal, has become something of a symbol in racing circles, though we never intended to be pioneers or role models. The afternoon passes in a blur of engine noise, instruction, and the particular joy of watching young faces light up with accomplishment. By closing time, I'm exhausted, but satisfied in a way podium finishes never quite managed. Ready to go? Angela asks, finding me in the office reviewing applications for our scholarship program. She wraps her arms around me from behind, chin resting on my shoulder. Almost. I lean into her embrace. Do you ever miss it? The competition, the adrenaline? Sometimes. Her honesty is one of the things I love most about her. But this feels like what we were meant to do all along. On the drive to Elena's house, we pass the sprawling complex that houses Bailey Racing. Their new star driver has been making headlines, though the team never regained its former dominance after the scandal and my departure. Elena's modest home glows with warm light against the darkening sky. She meets us at the door, her smile so like my own it still startles me sometimes. I made your favorite, she says, ushering us inside where the scent of homemade pasta fills the air. We settle into what has become our Thursday tradition: dinner, wine, and stories. Elena shares another piece of Victor, my father, with each visit. Tonight, it's about their first date at a demolition derby. He was horrified by the waste of good engines, she laughs. Kept wincing every time there was a collision. That sounds familiar, Angela teases, nudging me. Someone got very upset at our demolition demonstration last month. Those were perfectly good quarter panels. I protest, but I'm laughing too. Later, after Elena has shown us newly discovered photos of Victor in his early racing days, we drive home in comfortable silence. Our house, a contemporary with large windows overlooking the mountains, welcomes us with the automatic lights sensing our approach. We should tell her soon, Angela says as we change for bed. About the expansion plans. I nod, thinking of the paperwork finalizing our adoption application, sitting in my desk drawer. After her birthday next month, one celebration at a time. When Angela kisses me goodnight, I'm struck by how far we've come from that first confrontation in the pit lane. How a journey that began with searching for my identity led to creating something entirely new. A family pieced together from broken parts, stronger for having been rebuilt. In the morning, we'll return to the academy where 20 girls are learning not just how to drive fast, but how to navigate a world that often wants to define them by others' expectations. I'll watch Angela teach them about engines and physics and determination, and I'll remember that the most important races aren't always on tracks. Sometimes, they're the long, winding roads that lead you home to yourself, and to the people who see you clearly enough to love you for exactly who you are.